Welcome to Life Stories, where we dive deep into the emotional journeys that shape our lives. In today's story, we follow Claire, a woman at a crossroads in her marriage. After a chance encounter with a kind stranger, she is forced to confront the complexities of her emotions, the choices she must make, and the life she truly desires. It's a tale of self-discovery, longing, and the difficult decisions that come when we realize we've lost ourselves. Join us as we explore Claire's story and the turning point that changes everything. Make sure to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story. It was a late afternoon when it happened. The sky, painted in soft shades of orange and pink, had that particular look, the kind of sunset that felt like a quiet apology from the universe after a long, hard day. I was driving back from my sister Rachel's house, the familiar roads stretching out in front of me like a dull ribbon. My mind was busy, racing through the same arguments I had with David the night before, the same ones we had been having for months, maybe years. It was always the same cold silence, the kind that fills up the space between two people until it feels suffocating. The unspoken words, building a wall brick by brick until I couldn't remember how we ever spoke to each other without bitterness creeping into every conversation. I didn't even notice how far I had driven. I was lost in thought, replaying our fight over and over in my mind, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. I couldn't recall the last time I had truly felt seen or heard by David. We had become like two strangers who had somehow found themselves living under the same roof. And yet, every day, I got up, put on my mask, and went through the motions, pretending that everything was fine. The hum of the tires on the road was the only sound, comforting in its monotony, like a soft lullaby pulling me further away from the reality I didn't want to face. Then, without warning, the car stuttered, a sputter, then another, and then it simply died. I felt my heart sink as the engine gave its final gasp. The road ahead was empty, stretching on forever, and for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the dashboard, unsure of what to do. There was no phone signal, no passing cars, just the quiet of the countryside wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't even hear the usual sounds of distant traffic or birds overhead, just an unnerving stillness that seemed to echo inside me. It was then that the tears came. Not dramatic sobbing, but quiet, tired tears, the kind that come when you've been holding too much inside for too long. The kind that you don't even realize are there until the dam breaks. I wiped my eyes quickly, trying to regain composure, but the weight of it all was too much. I had been drifting through life, trying to ignore the cracks in my marriage, trying to ignore the ache that had taken root deep inside me. And in that moment, it all felt too heavy to carry any longer. I glanced around, searching for some sign of life, some hint that I wasn't completely alone. And that's when I saw it, a narrow dirt path, half hidden by tall grass, leading up to what looked like a farmhouse. It wasn't much, a small, humble place, but it seemed like the only option. I hesitated for a moment, the silence of the place making me feel unsure. But then again, what choice did I have? My phone was barely clinging to life, the battery almost dead, and the sun was dipping lower in the sky. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for help that might never come. With my heart pounding in my chest, I stepped out of the car and started walking up the path. The air smelled different, earthy, fresh, and clean, a far cry from the city smells I was used to. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes, each step seeming to echo in the quiet. As I approached the farmhouse, I saw him, a man standing near a barn, leaning against an old tractor, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked up when he saw me, his face calm, his eyes curious but not judgmental. Something about the way he stood there, so steady, so sure, made me feel just a little less afraid. I don't know what I expected him to say. Maybe a polite excuse or a quick brush off. But instead, he nodded slowly, meeting my eyes. "Well, let's see what we can do," he said, his voice low, steady, and warm. There was no hesitation, no questions, just a simple willingness to help. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back, I can see now that it was one of those moments that doesn't announce itself. It creeps up on you quietly, like a shadow at dusk. You don't realize the weight of it until much later when you're piecing it all together. Looking back, and that moment, his kind, simple gesture, changed something inside me. Not just in that moment, but in the weeks that followed. I followed him to the barn, my shoes crunching against the gravel. And as we walked, I realized something. I didn't need to be in a rush. Or to be anywhere. The world around me had slowed down. The noise of my life muffled by the quiet of this place. I didn't realize how much I needed the quiet until I was standing in it. Watching a stranger dig out tools from a dusty toolbox. Moving with such calm precision as if this was just another ordinary evening for him. It was a world away from the noise and chaos of my life. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of peace settle inside me. As I watched him, I began to realize just how far I had drifted from myself. My life wasn't bad, on paper. Everything looked fine. I had a nice house, a stable job, and a husband who did what he was supposed to. But there was this space between David and me. A space that had grown so wide over the years that it felt like we were living on opposite sides of the world. And it was in this quiet farmhouse, standing next to a stranger, that I started to feel the weight of it. The loneliness, the distance, the fact that I hadn't felt truly seen in so long. But there was something about Mark, the farmer, that made me feel different. He didn't know me. He didn't have to. Yet, in that moment, as he worked on my car, there was a kindness in him, a quiet strength, that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Mark worked on my car with such quiet precision, his movements deliberate and confident. I stood nearby, unsure of what to do with myself, feeling like an intruder in this world I didn't belong to. But there was something grounding about the way he worked, something steady that made me feel like I could breathe a little easier. The barn smelled of wood and oil, the warm glow of a single light bulb casting long shadows across the walls. Tools hung neatly on hooks, and the faint scent of sawdust lingered in the air. The atmosphere felt so simple, so honest. There was no pretense here, no need to put on a mask. I could just be. As I watched him, I realized how much I had missed feeling like this, like I wasn't just going through the motions of my life. My thoughts began to wander, and before I knew it, I found myself talking, first about the car, then about my trip to see Rachel, and finally about the fight I had with David that still weighed heavily on my chest. Mark didn't interrupt, he didn't judge, he just nodded occasionally, his eyes focused on the task at hand. There was a quiet understanding in his gaze, as though he could see through the surface of my words and into the deeper truths I wasn't ready to admit. It felt strange to be talking to someone I had just met about things I hadn't even shared with my closest friends. But there was something about the way Mark listened, so patiently, so without judgment, that made me feel like it was okay to let it out. The more I spoke, the more I realized how much I had been holding in, the more I realized how much I had been suppressing, burying under the surface, just to keep things together. But now, in this quiet place, surrounded by someone who didn't know me and didn't have any expectations, I found myself letting go. I caught myself glancing at him more than I should have, how his hands moved, strong and capable, as he worked on the engine. The faint crease between his brows as he concentrated. The way his eyes seemed to focus so completely on the task at hand. There was something magnetic about him. Something more than just his physical presence. It wasn't just attraction. There was something deeper at play. I couldn't quite name it, but it was there, pulling at something inside me. When Mark finally looked up at me, our eyes met for just a moment too long. The air between us shifted, charged with something I couldn't explain. I quickly looked away, my cheeks flushing, but the feeling lingered. By the time Mark had the car running again, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in twilight. I thanked him over and over, probably more than was necessary, but he just smiled and shrugged, his expression calm and unreadable. "It's nothing," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm just glad I could help." We stood there for a moment, in the quiet of the evening, the cool air settling around us. It felt like one of those moments where time had slowed down, and the world had stopped for just a breath. There was no rush, no urgency, just the two of us standing in the quiet, Then, almost hesitantly, Mark spoke again. "You should come in for a cup of tea before you go," he said, his voice soft, but there was an underlying tone of concern. "It's a long drive, and it's already getting late." I hesitated. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct told me to decline. I should thank him, get in my car, and drive away, but something about the way he said it, soft, unassuming, made it impossible to refuse. I nodded slowly, my voice quieter than I intended. "Okay, just a quick cup," I said, not quite sure why I agreed, but knowing that I needed something. I needed something more than just to drive away and go back to the emptiness of my home. As I followed him toward the house, my footsteps crunching on the gravel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I wasn't ready for. Something that would stay with me long after that night. The house was small, modest, but there was a quiet charm about it. It had an old-fashioned feel, with weathered wood and the kind of simplicity that spoke volumes. The porch light spilled a warm golden glow, illuminating a pair of worn boots by the door and a rocking chair that swayed gently in the breeze. It was the kind of place that felt timeless, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. For a moment, I envied the stillness. I envied the peace that seemed to surround this place. And I couldn't help but wonder if that was something I would ever find again in my own life. Mark held the door open for me, a small gesture that shouldn't have meant much but did. "Come on in," he said, his voice low and warm. I stepped inside, the smell of wood smoke and something sweet wrapping around me like a blanket. It felt safe, comforting, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The living room was simple, but inviting. A stone fireplace, a red armchair, shelves lined with books and knickknacks that hinted at a life well lived. It felt real, so real, compared to the carefully curated, sterile perfection of my own home. I ran my fingers over the edge of the couch. The fabric rough and worn but comforting in its imperfection. Everything about this place felt lived in, like it had a soul, a history, and in that moment, I realized just how much I had been craving that kind of simplicity. That kind of realness. Mark disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone for a moment. I took in my surroundings, noticing the small details, the chipped paint on the windowsills, the warm glow of the firelight, the quiet hum of the house as if it was alive with memories. And I realized then that I hadn't even realized how much I had missed feeling alive until that moment. As I sat on the couch, waiting for Mark to return from the kitchen, my thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess. The warmth of the house, the comforting scent of tea, and the flickering fire in the hearth were all so foreign to me. They were a world away from the cold, empty silence of my own home. A world away from David, whose presence had become so distant and detached that I often wondered if he even noticed the space between us anymore. Mark came back into the room, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. He handed me one, his fingers brushing mine in a brief moment of contact that sent a strange, unexpected jolt through me. "Chamomile," he said, his voice low and steady. "Hope that's all right." I nodded, taking the mug from him. But I could feel my pulse quicken. There was something about the way he handed me the tea, the way our hands brushed, that felt significant, and I wasn't sure if it was the tea or the way he made me feel that was making my heart race. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. It should have been awkward. It should have felt uncomfortable. But it didn't. The silence between us wasn't heavy, it was just comfortable. Like we had all the time in the world, and nothing needed to be said. But eventually, Mark broke the silence. "So, where were you headed before your car decided to give up on you?" he asked, his eyes steady on mine. "Home," I replied softly, the word tasting strange on my tongue. "I was visiting my sister. Just needed a change of scenery, I guess." Mark nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "Sometimes that's all you need," he said thoughtfully. "A little space, a little air." His words lingered in the air, and I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. I didn't need space. I didn't need air. I needed something else. Something I hadn't realized was missing until I was standing in that barn, talking to a stranger who made me feel heard, seen, alive. I looked down at my mug, tracing the rim with my finger. And for a moment, I couldn't speak. The weight of my thoughts pressed down on me. And I knew I had to say something. But I didn't know where to begin. How could I explain the emptiness I felt inside? How could I articulate the longing that had taken root in my chest? The ache that I had been trying to ignore for so long? Do you ever feel like you're stuck? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Like no matter what you do, you're just spinning your wheels? Mark was silent for a moment, his eyes distant as he took a sip of his tea. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, processing my question. He was a man of few words. But when he spoke, it always felt like he had something important to say. Yeah, he said finally, his voice low but firm. I think everyone feels that way at some point. But the thing is, wheels don't spin forever. Sooner or later, they catch on something. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. I had been spinning for so long, so lost in my own thoughts. My own feelings of inadequacy, that I had never stopped to ask myself if I was truly ready to move forward. What if they don't? I asked, my voice barely audible. What if the wheels never catch? Mark looked at me then, his eyes locking with mine. And for a moment, the air between us felt charged. It was as if he could see right through me, into the very core of my doubts, my fears, my confusion. And when he spoke, his voice was so quiet, so sure, that it felt like a promise. They will, he said simply. You just have to be ready when they do. And just like that, everything inside me seemed to shift. There was something about his presence, about the way he spoke, that made me feel like I could finally breathe. Like maybe, just maybe, everything I had been holding inside for so long could be let go. Maybe, just maybe, I was ready for whatever came next. But then the guilt came. A rush of it, so strong, so overwhelming, that it almost knocked me off balance. I was married. I had made vows. I had promised David that I would be faithful, that I would stand by him, no matter what. And yet, here I was, sitting in a stranger's house, feeling things I hadn't felt in years. I looked away, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. And I tried to push the feelings back. This wasn't right. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. I wasn't supposed to be sitting here, talking to Mark, feeling like he understood me more than David ever had. This was just a moment, a fleeting, temporary connection that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. But even as I told myself that, a part of me knew better. A part of me knew that things had changed. As the evening wore on, Mark and I continued to talk. But the conversation felt different now. There was a quiet tension between us. Unspoken but palpable. The air felt thick with everything we hadn't said. And as the minutes passed, I began to realize just how much I had been holding back. Just how much I had been afraid to face. By the time I stood to leave, the weight of the evening settled over me like a heavy blanket. The words I had spoken, the feelings I had shared, they would stay with me long after I left this place. And though I knew I had to go, a part of me didn't want to leave. Mark walked me to the door, his presence steady and grounding as I stepped onto the porch. The cool night air sent a shiver down my spine. And Mark, noticing, hesitated for a moment before draping his jacket over my shoulders. It's cold tonight, he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. I should have handed it back, thanked him, and left. But instead, I stood there, holding the jacket like it was an anchor. Something solid, something real in the midst of all the confusion swirling inside me. Thank you, I said again, my voice trembling. And as I got into my car and started the engine, I couldn't help but feel like something had shifted. That this wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something I wasn't ready for. As I drove away, Mark stood on the porch, watching me with an unreadable expression. The farmhouse disappeared into the night behind me, but his gaze lingered in my mind, a presence I couldn't shake. The drive home that night felt longer than it should have. The steady hum of the engine was a far cry from the storm that had been brewing inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about Mark, about the way he had listened to me, the way he had made me feel like I mattered for the first time in so long. But that wasn't all. There was a spark between us. Something undeniable. Something that felt like it could change everything. And that scared me. As I drove, My mind kept circling back to my marriage. To David, the man I had promised to love. To be faithful to, the man I had built my life with. Or so I thought. Somewhere along the way, our connection had started to fray. What used to be warmth between us had turned into coldness, distance, and silence. We were two people living side by side but never truly together. I tried to tell myself that it wasn't a big deal. I had just met Mark. It was just a fleeting moment. A brief connection. Nothing more. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that what I had felt, what we had shared, was real. And that terrified me more than anything. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on. Just like it always was. David was home. He was always home. But even in the quiet of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were worlds apart. The emptiness that had settled into my life over the years felt like a weight on my chest. The silence between us had become so thick that it was almost suffocating. I had tried everything, therapy, distractions, pretending that everything was fine, but nothing had worked. And now, after meeting Mark, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I was lost. I didn't know who I was, or what I wanted, or if I was even capable of finding it. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the familiar outline of the house, wondering what my next move should be. Part of me wanted to go inside, to try to reconnect with David, to find a way to fix things. But another part of me, the part that had been awakened by Mark's kindness and understanding, didn't want to go back. I didn't want to keep pretending that everything was okay when I felt so far from it. I took a deep breath and got out of the car. I needed to face whatever was waiting for me inside, even if I wasn't sure what it was anymore. David was in the kitchen. The soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. He looked up when I walked in. His expression neutral, like he had already resigned himself to the fact that we were just going through the motions. "Hey," he said, his voice tired but kind. "How was your trip?" "It was fine," I replied, my voice quieter than usual. I couldn't find the words to explain everything I had been feeling. The weight of the conversation we needed to have was too much to bear. I had no idea how to start. No idea how to bridge the gap that had grown between us. He nodded, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "I'm going to bed," he said, his voice distant. "I'm really tired." I watched him turn away and walk down the hallway to the bedroom. His footsteps echoing in the silence. It wasn't anger I felt. Not exactly. It was resignation. A deep, aching sense that we had both given up without ever truly admitting it. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the emptiness that filled the room. The house that once felt like home now felt like a stranger's place. Unfamiliar and cold. I knew that things couldn't go on like this. But what did I do? What was I supposed to do now? I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my feet dragging with the weight of the decision I knew I had to make. But I couldn't bring myself to face it just yet. I couldn't bring myself to confront the reality that my marriage was falling apart. Instead, I lay in bed next to David, his back turned to me, the space between us feeling like an entire ocean. I wanted to reach out to him, to close the distance, but I couldn't. It felt too big, too impossible. So I turned away, pulling the covers tightly around me, and let the tears come. In the days that followed, I tried to push thoughts of Mark out of my mind. I threw myself into work, into mindless tasks, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the thoughts of him kept creeping in. The way he looked at me, the way he listened to me, the way he made me feel like I wasn't invisible. I didn't know what it all meant, but I couldn't deny it. I thought about how I had tried so hard to fill the emptiness with other things, friends, hobbies, therapy, but nothing had ever worked. And now, in the quiet of my own home, I realized that I had been waiting for someone else to fill the void. Waiting for someone else to make me feel seen again. And maybe, just maybe, I had found that in Mark. But what did that mean for me? For David? For my marriage? I didn't know, but I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't feel something that had been missing for so long. As the days passed, I found myself questioning everything. What was I doing? What did I really want? Was it too late to fix my marriage? Was it too late to find myself again? The questions lingered, unanswered. as I navigated through the confusion of my emotions. And as much as I wanted clarity, I knew that there was no easy answer. I was standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. And with each passing day, I felt more lost, more uncertain, more unsure of who I was and where I was going. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore the truth forever. I couldn't keep living a lie. Sooner or later, I was going to have to make a choice. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that choice would mean. The days following my return home were filled with a strange mixture of guilt, confusion, and longing. Every moment I spent with David felt like an actor playing a role. We spoke, of course, about trivial things like bills and errands, but the conversations had become like empty rituals, devoid of any real connection. It was as if we were two people passing through each other's lives, coexisting without really living together. And all the while, Mark's presence lingered in the background, like a shadow I couldn't escape. The way he had looked at me, the quiet way he listened, how he made me feel as if I mattered, those things haunted me, filling every silent moment with a sense of longing I couldn't ignore. I knew it was wrong to feel this way. I knew that what was happening between Mark and me, this connection, this pull, was crossing a line I shouldn't be crossing. But the truth was, I didn't feel the same way about David anymore. At least, not the way I once had. I tried to push the feelings aside. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment of weakness, that it meant nothing. But when I closed my eyes, it wasn't David's face I saw. It was Mark's. And every time I replayed our conversation in my mind, the words Mark had spoken, simple and reassuring, echoed in my head. Wheels don't spin forever, he'd said. I kept thinking about that, wondering if it was true, wondering if maybe, just maybe, my life had been stuck in a rut for too long. I spent a lot of time looking at my reflection in the mirror, trying to figure out who I had become, who I was. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me, tired, uncertain, lost. I wanted to find myself again. I wanted to feel alive. I wanted to feel the kind of connection that had been so absent in my life for years. One evening, as I sat in the car in front of the grocery store, I found myself looking at my phone. The screen glowed in the dim light of the parking lot. And there, in my call history, was Mark's number. I couldn't believe it. How had I saved it? Why had I saved it? I didn't even realize I had. But there it was, staring at me like a temptation I couldn't resist. I didn't call him. I didn't know what to say, or if I should even say anything at all. But the truth was, I wanted to. I wanted to hear his voice, to know if he was feeling the same way I was, to know if the connection between us meant something more than just a brief encounter. But I didn't call. I couldn't. Instead, I closed my phone and drove home, my heart heavy with unspoken words. The guilt of it all weighed on me, but the longing was just as strong. How could I reconcile these two opposing forces? How could I find my way out of this mess I had created? I walked into the house, where David was sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine. The same routine, the same silence. He looked up when I entered, offering me a tired smile. But there was no warmth in it. We had become strangers to each other, both of us trapped in a life we had never imagined we would be living. Hey, you okay? He asked, his voice neutral. I'm fine, I said, not even sure if I was telling the truth. Just a long day. I couldn't bring myself to say what was really on my mind. The emptiness, the distance, the growing ache that felt like a physical weight in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to admit that I was so far from being fine. He nodded, turning his attention back to the magazine, and I realized how much of a stranger we had become to each other. We had stopped talking about anything that mattered long ago. The intimacy had disappeared, and in its place was a cold, mechanical relationship that neither of us knew how to fix. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I didn't know if I was supposed to fix my marriage, walk away, or keep pretending everything was okay. All I knew was that I was stuck, and the pull I felt toward Mark was becoming harder and harder to ignore. As I lay in bed that night, my back to David, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something had changed inside me. I wasn't the same woman I had been when I married David. I had tried so hard to be the woman he wanted me to be. the woman I thought I should be. But in doing so, I had lost myself. And now, standing at this crossroads, I didn't know who I was anymore. The thought of Mark, the way he had seen me, really seen me, was still fresh in my mind. And I couldn't deny it any longer. I had changed. I couldn't go back to the way things were. I wasn't sure where this journey would take me. Whether it would lead me back to David or push me into something new. But I knew one thing for certain. I was at a turning point. And the choices I made now would define the rest of my life. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if I was ready to face what was coming. Ready to face the consequences of the choices I had made. Because one thing was clear. I couldn't keep living in this in-between space forever. Sooner or later, I was going to have to choose a path. And the thought of that filled me with both fear and anticipation. As the days passed, I found myself standing at a crossroads, unable to deny the choices I had to make. The emotional weight of the past few weeks was overwhelming. But I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to decide whether to stay in a marriage that had become a shell of what it once was or take a leap into the unknown. Into something that made me feel alive again. The choice wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wished I could go back to the comfort of ignorance, where everything seemed simple and straightforward. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. I had changed. I had grown. The last few months had shown me that sometimes we need to face the truth of who we are and what we truly want. We can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. As difficult as it was, I understood now that facing my feelings, no matter how messy or complicated, was the only way forward. And so, I made my choice. It wasn't perfect, and I didn't have all the answers. But I was finally ready to take control of my own life. Ready to stop living in the shadows of what might have been and start embracing what could be. The future, uncertain as it was mine to shape. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you've ever found yourself at a crossroads, struggling to choose the right path, know that you're not alone. Life is full of difficult decisions, but it's also full of opportunities to grow and transform. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future stories. We'll continue exploring the twists and turns of life, the moments that change us, and the courage it takes to follow your heart. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.